to me, the impact of Brexit on health is something that has really taken quite a long time to come over the hill and come to prominence. It's certainly, as a medic, what I wrote and spoke about the referendum, prior to the referendum in 2016. But since then, by and large, the obsession has been about trade and goods and borders, and not actually how we keep ourselves healthy and how we look after people who are unwell. Very noticeably, having been in and seen the secret Brexit papers, there is an impact assessment on pharmaceuticals and one on chemicals. There isn't one on health, and there isn't one on the NHS. And to me, that is, and as was commented this morning, Jeremy Hunt is not part of that kind of sub-cabinet committee on Brexit. And to me, that's a failure to understand what we've been talking about all day, that what we've gained from Europe is the integration and working together. It isn't just about money, it's actually about cooperation. Now, for us in Scotland, obviously Chris talked about that our First Minister is meeting with the Prime Minister, and obviously we are arguing about Clause 11 and what is called the power grab, that powers that relate to competencies that are devolved would come to Westminster instead of to Scotland. And people are going, yeah, but you don't have them, they're in the EU. But in the EU, there's a level playing field for them. They're not particularly things we would expect to change, and we know what the legal and philosophical approach to them is. That's what we absolutely don't know what's going to happen in Westminster. We face every one of the problems that's been discussed today, but we don't have the powers to solve them. And when we have asked for things, particularly around what I would say is our number one issue, which is immigration, we've just been turned down flat. Now, in the 2001 census, Scotland's population was about to dive below 5 million. The eastward extension of the EU brought in many new people who came, and we call them New Scots. We don't call them non-Scots, we call them New Scots, who settled and made their homes and had their families. So our population came up. Our working age population is falling again. So our issue isn't just about our need for nurses and doctors and researchers, which we absolutely do, but it's having enough working age population to support our demography. So for Scotland, the immigration issue is actually existential. It is right up there, number one. And it isn't just about grudgingly allowing people to stay. We are talking about taking away rights that mean people are unlikely to want to come. If you want to come here and train in surgery, you're talking 10 to 15 years. Will you have the same rights at the end of the 15 years as at the beginning? ECJ disappears in 8. Will you be able to bring your family? Will you be able to settle? Because you will have committed to our system of NHS. So suddenly it won't be easy to go back to Spain. The next one is agencies, and obviously we had a lot of discussion around the agencies and what they have done, and that is very much this issue of it's the network of the EU. It's pretty lumpy sometimes, and most of us would not pretend everything is right, but it's 28 countries muddling and compromising their way through some of the biggest challenges, whether it's climate change or terrorism or public health or cybercrime. They try and get together and they try and come to a consensus. So it won't always be everybody's cup of tea, but it has given us huge benefits in health. So we talked about the EMA exhaustively. What we didn't touch on is the issue of Euratom. Now, I raised the issue of radioisotopes. The government has dismissed it because radioisotopes are not fissile. They are not controlled by Euratom. But we had a huge shortage of technetium, the commonest used isotope in medical scans, between 2008 and 2010. And as a breast cancer surgeon, I had to sit there and ration the one bone scan a week that I might get, the one patient who could have sentinel node biopsy that week for over a year. And it really held back the rolling out of sentinel node biopsy, which is a less destructive operation. That happened because two big reactors, one in Holland and one in Canada, shut down unexpectedly. What Euratom does, the Euratom Supply Agency, is they manage that. If they are aware of a problem in one area, they tell someone else, don't go offline for servicing, because they've got a problem. And they have managed the supply of radioisotopes. That won't change, but we're not part of it. So we're going to be at the back of the queue if there are shortages. And these reactors are 50, 60 years old. They are winding down. So it's things like that. It's not about what you pay in. It's not about creating a separate system. It's the fact that we were part of something that meant we got taken account of and we got supported. And the third thing that I would want to mention is the issue of trade deals. If you look at the powers that will be taken to Westminster instead of Scotland, you're talking about agriculture, you're talking about animal and vegetable hygiene, food safety, GM crops, etc., food labelling. So will we be allowed to label that something is a GM crop or that something has been raised in very poor animal husbandry standards? Because America has appalling animal husbandry standards and food illness rate that is 10 times what we have in the UK. So the issue isn't washing the chicken in chlorine, it's why they wash the chicken in chlorine is the issue. So for us, we have to consider the UK government will be going on its hands and knees, Liam and Theresa, to get a deal with Trump. What can the UK offer? So for us in Scotland, it's very clear that America wants the brand of Scotch whisky to be opened up so that they can have American whisky sold as Scotch. And one of the powers is public procurement. So for us, we had a big discussion this morning, obviously, about the threat to the English NHS because it's marketised, and that would be allow big American companies in. But they could equally challenge the Scottish border and say, this is a non-tariff barrier. You have no right to mark off in a unitary state a single area of NHS and say we can't bid for it. And if public procurement has come to Westminster, obviously that right could be taken away from us. So we have huge concerns about the fact that we can't deal with the challenges that are right across the UK, and huge concerns about the power grab to Westminster, that all of that will be about offering things that are precious to us in Scotland that currently we control on a plate to get Trump to play ball.
Thanks, Philippa. I mean, we're obviously just 4 years out from an independence referendum, which was closer than many expected it to be. What's your instinct for how the Brexit game is playing out? What is that doing to relationships between Scotland and Westminster and the bonds that bind us?
Oh, I mean, I think how Brexit's been handled, both from the fact that there was no acceptance that it should really be that each of the 4 countries would have to agree. So we have 2 countries, both Scotland and Northern Ireland, who voted to remain. And, you know, we're not just in the back seat of Theresa's car, we're kind of in the boot. And then onto that, you add the whole clause 11 that we will take control. And actually, you know, devolution was always just a mirage. We're the ones that are sovereign, we'll make the decisions. So actually, if you really want to create problems in Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement, if you actually really want to create problems and friction in Scotland, you would almost think it was deliberate. Yeah. And while polls and things haven't changed in Scotland, what you find when you talk to people in the ground is there were people who were yes, but voted leave and are therefore not sure what they would do. There are people who voted no, but are adamant remainers and are not sure. So things haven't moved, but there's definitely people saying the UK I voted to remain part of doesn't exist. And you know, I'm in no doubt there'll be a referendum again in the next 2 years.
I'm a little envious, I have to admit, that hearing Nicola Sturgeon is in speaking with Theresa May, because as you know, there is currently no government in Northern Ireland, so there is no head of state coming into Westminster, travelling Europe to make the case for Northern Ireland and its health services. And to be frank, this is something that has been raised with us numerous times in Brussels, across Europe, as a major disadvantage for Northern Ireland and indeed for Ireland. I'll come back to that shortly. A few words to begin with about the British Medical Association. We are one of only 3 national medical associations, including the French and the Germans, to have premises in Brussels. So we're actually very lucky in the sense that we are on the ground, so to speak, with the opportunity to speak to as many MEPs, the European Commission, etc., etc. And somewhat ironically, given the topic of today's conversation, the British Medical Association was the first national association to open premises in Brussels. The Germans and the French followed us. Now, I do hope that that is not the case in reverse. Now, thankfully, with the support of pan-European partners like the Standing Committee of European Doctors, to cite just one, and their constituent members like the Irish Medical Organisation, we have to date been able to get in to see Michel Barnier and his Article 50 task force. 6 of the 7 MEPs on the Brexit Steering Committee in the European Parliament, and almost the entirety of national governments from the EU 27 and the EFTA member states. Now, the good news is that nobody, and this should not surprise anybody here, wants a Brexit that threatens the European medical profession nor the patients they serve. The bad news is that UK PLC's brand is tarnished, perhaps irrevocably so. And indeed, a lot of highly intelligent people in high positions of power across Europe worryingly do not understand that the UK, like the BMA, is made up of 4 distinct nations. And there's a huge amount of conflation that England, les Anglais, represent the UK, and conflation of the Leave vote. Nigel Farage has a lot to answer for, unfortunately, with the wider UK. And indeed, when I've been speaking to individuals in various civil service departments across Europe, the tone of conversation changes massively. And indeed, it's the first time in my professional career that having this accent has been advantageous. In the sense that when people realise I am there not as a pro-Brexiteer UKIP spokesman, but there on behalf of part of the UK which voted to remain, and I'm there to talk about dealing with the challenges, opportunities entirely hypothetical. We know that, to be frank, they don't exist. The atmosphere changes massively. One example, too, to demonstrate that. We were speaking to an unnamed MEP. He was complaining about the English UKIP wanting to take back their empire, and all of the arguments, a little hackneyed, but some truth in them, when his assistant elbowed him gently and said, well, this gentleman's from the British Medical Association and he's from Belfast. The mask changed, or the scales fell off. He stood up and he embraced me. And the conversation after that was very, very different, as you can imagine, in a positive sense. Now, I'm not just telling you this to flatter myself, to flatter the fact that I'm luckily, from Northern Ireland. I can have an Irish passport, thankfully. But to make the point that there is a huge amount of goodwill out there within the EU institutions and across Europe. And that goodwill is actually being translated into concrete solutions within the draft withdrawal agreement, within the European Parliament's draft resolution, the European Council's conclusions. So, with regard to Northern Ireland, Ireland, the North, call it what you will, yesterday in the Parliament, President Juncker was talking about Brexit not being an Irish issue, about it being a European issue. And if you look at the text of the agreement, that's actually being represented accurately. With regard to the ongoing funding of cross-border healthcare services on the island of Ireland, the EU has currently funded, I think, approximately 30 million euros this century for cross-border healthcare projects. There are an additional 50 million euros in pending applications. The draft agreement of December 2017 commits the EU and the UK to the ongoing support of those projects. So, very good news. Now, of course, there's no point in having cross-border healthcare projects funded unless there is free movement, both of patients and of medical professionals, and indeed the ongoing mutual recognition of those medical professionals' qualifications. So, yet again, and quite positively, if you look at the draft agreements, there are provisions in place for the ongoing support of the common travel area, which in fact will allow the ongoing free movement of people across the border, and also the ongoing mutual recognition of professional medical qualifications, at least up until the end of the proposed transition period. So, in short, a lot of positivity. Now, to temper that positivity, and I alluded to this at the start of the intervention, there are 2 negative points that are continually being flagged with us at European level and within the Irish government. The first one, of course, it's the fact that there is no Northern Irish government, there is no Northern Irish head of state, statelets, in place to make the case at the highest possible levels. Now, myself and my colleagues speaking to Michel Barnier's colleagues about this carry some weight. If Arlene Foster, Michelle O'Neill were in that room making the same point, the case is made in a much, much more effective manner. So I don't think, unfortunately, we can underestimate the negative impact that a lack of government in Northern Ireland is having. The second issue, the second negative issue, and it's perhaps a little bit less familiar to you, it's the level of lobbying that different bigger, better resource sectors are playing in the Brexit debate in Ireland. For example, the agri-food sector. An MEP speaking to us off the record admitted that probably for each one meeting that he has with civil society, he has 10, 11 or 12 meetings with the agri-food sector. And they're telling us that whilst our concerns, the concerns of the medical profession and the patients they represent, are valid, hugely important, there is a risk that due to this sheer volume of lobbying of the agri-food sector, business, the electricity markets, of course we could continue, there is a serious risk that the concerns of the health profession in Ireland risk slipping through the cracks. Now, there is a limited amount that the British Medical Association can do to counteract this huge amount of lobbying. We will try, of course, and you will excuse this piece of shameless self-promotion. We're actually hosting an event in the European Parliament on the 23rd of May entitled Keeping Europe Healthy, Brexit and the European Medical Profession. And one of the three issues that we'll be flagging up will be the Irish issue and how we can help keep those concerns at the top of both the UK and the EU's negotiating priorities list. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And obviously on the mainland of Britain, I feel like we are very aware of the danger that is there to the Good Friday Agreement and to those relations which have grown and taken root between the Republic and the North. What would your best guess be about post the transition phase? What will happen to the integrated health systems that you've got at the moment?
To surmise, the BMA's position is that things are working very, very well, and we'd like the status quo to continue. Now, what political settlement is required to deliver that? As you know, Northern Ireland is a highly political place, so we're not in a position to say whether we would like solution A, B or C. Our line is to the politicians, what is currently in place is working, has been working and has been improving. Do your jobs and deliver.
Can I just say, I don't think that it's just in Europe that your lack of government, lack of head of state is a problem. It's actually the fact here in Westminster where decisions are being made. There is a lack of representation of both sides of the community. We only have one side of the community having a voice, but also there isn't a leader to come to JMC meetings and to argue the case. And so, although Northern Ireland is where I'm from originally, almost the most impacted, it's a little bit sat on the side, and very concerning to hear senior UK politicians talking about Good Friday agreements had its day and it's a bit of a nuisance, we should just get rid of it so we can do Brexit. If you had a proper voice there, that wouldn't be allowed to happen.
Okay, my contribution is going to focus more on the constitutional context against which future UK health policy, or properly health policies, reflecting the four different emerging policies that we've seen developing since the devolution process has been underway. So understanding something of that constitutional context and reflecting on what the process of withdrawing from the EU is meaning or may mean for the scope of devolved competence. Because what we've heard already is quite clearly this process of withdrawal is challenging our existing understandings of devolution and disrupting what has been until now a story of deeper and further devolution with ever wider powers and over increasing areas, and which have been endorsed through successive referenda. And which, if we sort of look to the health field specifically, we've seen an increasing divergence in the health systems operated across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, reflecting different public policy choices, whether that's in relation to, for example, Wales's organ donation regime, also Scotland's minimum alcohol pricing regime. Now, as the ongoing process of seeking to get our legal house in order within the UK to prepare us for exit continues, what's very clear is this process of bringing powers back is very politically fraught and has given the UK government cause to perhaps rethink the existing devolution settlements. And we do see this process of attempted sort of re-centralisation of at least a a return of powers or a freezing of existing powers, and a new set of conditionalities that may emerge around the exercise of those devolved competences. We will have heard today, and apologies for arriving when I did, but the different forms of regulatory interventions, the specific positive regulatory intervention that we see from the EU, where it creates new regimes, common regimes, whether that's medical devices, whether it's reciprocal healthcare. But what we should also recognise is that role of EU free movement law, the general principles that apply, and that have had an important role in checking domestic policy choices. So those devolved UK policy choices that may have a problematic impact as far as the internal market, EU internal market logic is concerned. A clear example, of course, the minimum pricing attempt in Scotland. Now, that might be initially caught as being potentially problematic from a free movement of goods perspective, that it would create a barrier to trade. But what EU internal market law also provides is an opportunity to justify that potential disruption to the internal market. And so you have a balancing that is possible within the EU legal context for the free movement, the economic imperative on one side, and public goods, which public health is another, and it's finding a proportionate basis within that. Now, what we don't know going forward is what model or idea of an internal market we may be working with within the UK. We haven't heard of a UK internal market before. We haven't needed to hear of an internal market at UK level before, but now it's being discovered. But it's being presented, it's being used at the moment to define where we need these new common frameworks, where we may need to re-centralise powers or create UK-wide frameworks, which is, it seems to be essentially a return of those powers, rather than, as has been suggested, we need to find a way of accommodating that parity of esteem for the different partners to come up together with common solutions. We don't have the infrastructure yet to do that, so it looks like we would fall back on a UK Parliament legislating for these things, or UK ministers taking action in those ways. But we're finding this notion of internal market that at the moment is a very thin notion. We don't know what it means in a UK context. We don't know what other values may be present within this internal market context. But we do know that it's being used to determine where powers are going. But looking to the future, if we look at that series of different policy areas that were set out in that framework approach, it's all secondary legislation in there. There's no primary treaty provisions in there. So there's nothing in there about what would happen with something like Scotland's minimum alcohol pricing in a post-Brexit UK. Will we see this notion of a UK internal market taking on a more substantive force and being able to be used to reach in to competence? And so we've got problems now about what's being decided and how it's being decided from a devolved perspective. But we also need to keep in mind that this isn't the end of the story, that there are going to be other issues that flow out from this as we go forward.
Thanks, Joe. And you mentioned the powers that are being repatriated, and I think the number's 111 is the one that's thrown around. And of those, Westminster says it wants to keep hold of about 20 or so 24. Temporarily. Is your instinct that is it an actual power grab, or do they have a point that until the full thing is sorted, there are certain powers that they need to keep at Westminster to prevent, say, divergence in Scotland and Wales before they've done trade deals?
I think there is they're different in mentality that is approaching this from a UK unitary state approach that sees Westminster as having the sovereignty to take these decisions. And then another approach that says we've had 20 years of devolution, we've had commitments being made to respect that developing, that sovereignty doesn't only reside in Westminster, that there are alternative readings of our constitution that are possible, and that there are other ways, or there should be other ways, of doing shared governance that we haven't had a tradition of. Where we have done things together, it's been in the context of EU policy making. And so at the moment, the only things we know is how do we do this? Well, it goes to Westminster or it goes to Whitehall to do it for the whole UK. And so there's a need to cooperate and to coordinate, and that's recognised across the board. It's how that happens and what the structures are for that.
I mean, the key word, that Mike Russell was saying is it should be agree. Talking about talking to or consulting, we know that from the JMC meetings, we had months and months of them not happening, is completely meaningless. It should have been that you bring the 4 governments around a table and you agree a common framework. But all this talk about internal UK market, Scotland has quite different rules. We don't allow the growing of GM crops. England does. We have stronger animal husbandry standards in certain aspects. It doesn't seem to cause a problem at the moment. So I'm not convinced it's about the internal UK market. If it says Scottish beef or English beef and there's a difference, that's up to you what you buy. To me, it's about offering the whole package in trade deals.
And running forward, something like the GM, that's been sort of listed in the list came out at the end of last week of areas where it would be okay for these to go back, and the devolved could carry on making whatever choices they wish, and then sort of the sliding scale up to where we would need legislative intervention, and then some areas where they say, well, actually, these were never devolved anyway. These are reserved, and GM falls within one of those areas where they're saying we need a UK-wide response. At the moment, the EU framework permits a regional response. The EU framework has principles such as subsidiarity running through that, and we don't have any sort of self-standing principle of subsidiarity within a UK constitutional context, separate from what we know in the EU. And so it's, what are we standing to lose as we sort of roll forward? And it's, what are the ways that we could perhaps secure some of these things, either within the withdrawal bill or in other supporting mechanisms to try and respond to the potential loss.
If I could just point out, David Liddington talks about the 86 or whatever it is, going back to the devolved nations or to Scotland, those ones are specifically Scotland, initially. There's that phrase initially, meaning that in actual fact, a year or two down the line, we could be having exactly the same Barney about another 20 powers that suddenly they've decided actually need to come back here. And the problem is while it might be temporary, if you set frameworks that have been set from Westminster and are fixed, then that actually limits what the devolved nations can do with their powers.
And of course, from the Northern Irish perspective, there is no head of state, there is no deputy head of state making the arguments with regard to any of the sectors. And specifically with regard to health, there is a Brexit task force within the Northern Irish Civil Service. The heads of the secretariats for agriculture, the economy, and several others are in that, of course, making the case for their specific sectors. It won't surprise you, unfortunately, that the health department is not represented within that discussion group. So Northern Ireland is having a double whammy, no representation, no senior political representation, and then within the civil service discussions, no health representation, despite the protestations of the BMA.
That seems something of an oversight. I'd like to open the floor up to questions now, so if you'd like to raise your hand if you've got something to ask the panel, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Exhaustion is set
That's
in.
right, at the end of the day.
Very thorough presentations.
Anyone? No? Well, okay. Philippa, perhaps you could...
Chairman's prerogative.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about how integrated the Scottish and English NHS is, because obviously, as we talked about, there's been divergence since, well, the health service has always been in the hands, I guess, of the Scottish office, but since the Scottish Parliament came into being, there have been a lot more debates about health policy and choices made that have taken things off down a different road.
Well, the structure is now quite different, as you rightly say. Right from 48, the Scottish NHS was a separate body, but obviously it came under Department of Health through the Scottish office. So right up till 1999, we had the same, we had trusts, we had competition, we had fund holders and the internal market and all of these kind of things. But straight away in 99, after devolution, we kind of turned on our heel and started moving in the opposite direction. And from 2004, we got rid of hospital trusts. I think around 2009, 2008, we got rid of primary care trusts. So we actually just have health boards. So when you're talking about accountable care organisations, we have an area delivery of healthcare. But instead of there being the risk of it being a huge multinational healthcare company or McKinsey or somebody at the top making the decisions, it's a statutory body. It is accountable. You can FOI them. They have to publish things. And that's one of the real dangers of the marketisation that's been happening in NHS England. Now, obviously, some of that happened. Labour brought in independent treatment centres, and indeed brought them in Scotland between 97 and 99, but we got rid of them. And then, of course, the Health and Social Care Act that we discussed in a lot of detail this morning just was the nuclear option. And what we've seen is this drive through Section 75 of having to put services out to tender. It's almost half of services last year went to a private provider. And the problem is they have a shareholder driver, they have to make profit, therefore they have to look at what they can cut in that service. And to me, the biggest impact is the fragmentation. You have competition instead of cooperation. And that makes integration, whether within a health service or between health and social care, really difficult. Now, we've been working since 2014, was the last health board area to come online with health and social care integration, but it isn't easy. Ours is integrated joint boards, and a bag of money comes from health and a bag of money comes from social care and goes on the table. But at least we stop bitching about who's responsible for Mrs. Jones, because she's safely in a hospital bed at £300 a day, so you won't give her a care home place because you're busy looking after somebody else. So they now sit down and go, right, what's the most sensible place for Mrs. Jones? And that has made a difference. It's helped our delayed discharges and things go down. But it's not easy. It's not easy to get hospitals to give up power and control, and it's not easy simply to provide the social care that we need. But we still have in Scotland a single public NHS, whereas the whole drive since the Health and Social Care Act has been the fragmentation. CCGs enshrine postcode prescribing across England. If you live in one area, you can have a treatment. If you live somewhere else, you can't. And that is not what the principle of the NHS is. And it's that opens up the NHS in England to EU competition law, and also opens it up to being dragged into things like a US trade deal.
Paul, you saying you've been spending some time in Brussels. It's not strictly a health question, but when you're speaking to officials from the European Commission and politicians over there, what is the view that you pick up of the way Britain is conducting itself in the negotiations as we go through them?
There is the official view, which is that we're conducting ourselves in a reasonable manner. There is the unofficial view, which things are moving from a shambles to a superlative that I can't actually find in my mind to describe. So, as I said, the reputation of UK PLC is being severely tarnished, irrevocably, perhaps. If I could just make a point about the extent to which the development of cross-border healthcare services has happened in the last 25 to 30 years in the north of the island. So a couple of examples will suffice. As of May 2016, there has been a bilateral agreement in place between the Northern Irish and the Republic of Irish Health Services, in short, to provide radiotherapy and cardiology services in Altnagevin Hospital in Northern Ireland. Now, that provides services to over 500,000 patients in the north of the island. And perhaps the most stark example, to date, in just under 2 calendar years, 27 patients, 27 heart attack victims from County Donegal in the Irish Republic have received life-saving primary care treatment in Altnagevin Hospital. So, quite simply, and not to over-egg the example, for those individuals, it is a matter of life and death. So when you talked previously about what is at risk and what are we calling for, we're calling, to repeat myself, for a continuation of the system, or a different system, which allows that type of vital life-saving cooperation to continue. In short, Brexit cannot happen with regard to health and social care in Ireland. If it does, it's a catastrophe.
Joe, as a lawyer, you mentioned that thinking about the UK internal market and that we're used to dealing externally with the EU and we're now having to work more closely together. Do you think we have the right vehicles in place for dispute resolution and things like this between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England? Do we need to rethink the...
I can see a snigger coming.
I know what you want.
We don't have any dispute resolution mechanism
I think
at all.
There aren't the structures. The
which is last
structures aren't
resort.
there. There are no structures for that sort of cross-nation working beyond the joint ministerial councils that we have. But they have become. There are very clear limitations with those councils, and there have been suggestions about new ways of working and a move to a more federal structure for the UK. And this is perhaps one of those moments where some of that big constitutional thinking should be taking place.
A constitution would be a start, a written constitution.
But very much no, those structures simply aren't in place.
So what would that look like then? A better set of structures? How would you design them?
Well, there are a number of suggestions in terms of what might be needed for the decision-making processes. And one of the things that we've had some suggestions coming from within Wales, from the First Minister, from Carwyn Jones, that's talked about having a sort of a council of ministers operating at a UK basis. At the moment, it's not a decision-making. Those JMCs are not decision-making bodies. If they do become decision-making bodies, we need to have proper systems of oversight and accountability. Where are the parliaments and the assemblies in this process? So it's a sort of a radical sort of reconstruction of what we have. We have, if it is something like policing, when we look at how the EU works with something like the internal market project, there are both ex ante and ex post controls, ways of ensuring that how decisions are taken sort of respect the internal market rationale, that if you are going to legislate, that you inform that technical specification notification to the Commission as an independent body to assess any sort of legislative intervention that might take place. We could again, a lot of these suggestions are borrowing from what we see within the EU, which sees different sovereign states coming together to share powers. And so there are things that we could perhaps read across from how the EU operates, whether that's something like a Council of Ministers, but with sufficient sort of democratic support.
Yeah. I suppose one of the things to think about is that the impact of Brexit is so vast and so disturbing to the way we've been doing things that, as Philippa mentioned, she says there'll be another independence referendum within 2 years. There may or may not be, I don't know. But I think the sense of the Union as bringing together four nations where you've got one very, very large nation and then you've got three much smaller ones, and it worked because we were able to balance things out properly. So from a Scottish perspective, although we are 6 million of the 60 odd million, we provided prime ministers, we felt we had a weight in the decisions that were taken. And I think Brexit is the first time, setting aside general elections and government select, the first time in my lifetime that I've been aware of a sort of fault line appearing in the structure of the Union and the way that things work. And I don't think that's really fed through properly yet. I think maybe when we see the Brexit settlement, when we see the transition phase end and we're confronted with the reality that Scotland's out, Northern Ireland's out, it's just sawing away at those little bonds that have kept us together. And in Scotland, they're not that strong, or not as strong as they used to be. We're still looking at sort of 45 to 50% split on the future of Scotland.
I think also, obviously part of the debate and the vow and what was put forward was, much more powers, Devo Max, Home Rule, as close to federal. And we had a Scotland Act within which not a single amendment of the SNP, the governing party of Scotland, was accepted. The one change that was accepted in a government amendment was to put the Sewell Convention into that legal structure and to supposedly make the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, something that could not be got rid of, could not be undermined, and where there had to be consent to anything that interfered with a devolved power. Obviously, in the Gina Miller case, what we were told was it had been drafted as normally, a little tricky word in there that meant it wasn't worth the paper it's written on. And what we've moved to now is obviously the whole, we're going to take control of these and we will decide the UK structures, not we will agree the UK structures. And that's what the Scottish and Welsh governments, if it was agree, we will sit round the table and agree frameworks, this would already be done. But that is not being accepted. And therefore, when there is another referendum, and I think at some point people in Scotland are going to want to choose, particularly as the reality comes over the hill, that whole argument of, we'll devolve more, people are going to be saying, well, what's the point? You just turn around and can take it back. And that whole adage of power devolved is power retained is never been more obvious to people in Scotland than right now.
Yeah, and that sense that you're being listened to when decisions are being taken. As a journalist, I've got many Brexiter friends, Brexiter journalists, politicians, and I've said to them, if you had the choice between Scotland leaving the UK and Brexit happening, so you could stay in the EU and keep Scotland, or leave the EU and lose Scotland, which would you do? And unanimously, so far, it's been we'd rather leave the EU and Scotland disappears. And I think there's
a survey, I think there's a poll showing that, and I think it was 80-something% of leavers don't particularly mind losing Scotland, don't actually particularly mind losing Northern Ireland.
Right, and the Good Friday Agreement as well is now being held up as something that is...
And irrelevance, according to some Brexiteer politicians.
Yeah. So the messages being sent out to the devolved governments are not particularly heartwarming or welcoming or...
Well, not the, don't leave, we love you, which is what we had from David Cameron in 2014.
Well, if you take, to move away slightly from the health sector, if you take the most marked example of, shall we say, UK disdain for Northern Ireland, speaking personally, if you look at Team GB at the Olympic Games, quite simply the British Olympic
Mary
team
Peters
ignores Northern Ireland in its very name. And that's the level of disdain is perhaps a very strong word, but I'll stick with it.
I don't know whether anyone has thought of questions. You've had all of that time. There we go. There's someone coming with a mic. Just because I think we're recording it and there may be people with hearing aids and using a loop.
I don't know if it's relevant now, but when you were saying that you got rid of the trusts and is a good experience? Do you think it was a mistake and probably England will have to why is
you think you're asking, do I think getting rid of them in Scotland was a mistake? Or
no,
that
it was a mistake implementing the trust, and that since you have got rid of the trusts, everything works better. So because I believe that in England probably they are starting to experience that they are not working? Or?
Well, I mean, certainly it was a positive experience, and it actually wasn't that difficult, to be honest. It's put forward as being something that was very difficult. It wasn't. It was just simply, right, okay, we're working our way back. So initially it was in my county, 2 competing trusts that had developed a terrible us and them mentality among staff. I mean, it was really, you're that team or that team. We officially became one trust at first, and then it disappeared and we became the board. It took quite a long time to get rid of the us and them, but it wasn't a problem of structures or legality. But if you look, there are estimates that £5 to £10 billion are wasted purely on the administration of the healthcare market in England. So that isn't your internal management, that's just your bidding, your tendering, your corporate lawyers. Well, that could be spent getting rid of the kind of £3 billion deficit, a bit of redesign, a bit of social care. That would go a long way. And then what you have internally, if you're going to have that kind of market, what we had that started in '89 was what was called resource management, which suddenly meant there was huge amounts of work trying to work out how much a gallbladder cost, how much a hip replacement cost, even though we weren't selling them. But that was the beginning from '88 onwards of that drift to looking at the costs of things. In England, you have the tariff. We want hospitals not to bring in people who don't need to be there. That's who they make money off. If you're really, really sick, the tariff often doesn't cover you. If you're not so sick, they make a little bit of money out of it. So in the integration, we'll be asking the local big hospital to possibly take a really existential financial threat. And to me, it's all of that. It's the Section 75, it's things like the tariff. You need to go back to, this is Nottingham. How many people do we have? How many diabetics? How many breast cancer? What do we need? And you then are looking at where's the best place to put things. And that's what we've been able to do. And we move people around. And we do, obviously, there are people who come to England, there are people who are on holiday in Scotland. We have these agreements, and we have these agreements actually with Southern Ireland and across Europe. So there isn't any difficulty. But we pay. When I send a patient to Leeds to get a special kind of MRI-guided biopsy, it's £1,500 for the biopsy, and my health board has to pay all the travel and accommodation. So it's not that it gets given to us. Your home health board pays for it, and we already have those systems. And that internally, there's absolutely no reason why that should change.
I'm actually one of the researchers who's been involved in the Future of England survey, which is the source of the data about leavers in England and their attitude to the Good Friday Agreement and to independence in Scotland. And our most recent findings from last year's survey said that 81% of leavers, rising to 87% of conservative leavers in England, were prepared to destabilise the Good Friday Agreement in the interest of getting the form of Brexit they preferred. Even larger groups, 88% of English leavers, rising to 92% of conservative supporting English leavers, were prepared to countenance Scottish independence as a price for the Brexit that they preferred. I would say that these are numbers based on asking people about a real live political issue, in other words, Brexit, and the prospect of independence. So I wouldn't want people to immediately jump on these numbers as precisely indicative, but I think the scale of the results are sufficient to indicate that there is something important going on in the minds of the general public in relation to leave and the future of the UK as a state.
If I can just jump in there, it's for myself speaking as a Northern Irishman, it's deeply ironic that Brexit and the potential breakup of the Union was occasioned by a party whose full name is the Conservative and Unionist Party. It's unfortunate for some. Given that there are actually relatively few questions, if I may, I would take a question or a comment that was raised during a previous panel. It was about potential challenges and opportunities from Brexit. A line that has stuck with me, I think, from a Northern Irish journalist, that with regard to Brexit and Northern Ireland, there are many, many serious challenges, and the only opportunities that exist are for smugglers.
Well, in Scotland, obviously, our fish catchers would see it as an opportunity, because obviously they were a group that voted leave in Scotland, and they would get out of the common fisheries policy and they would be able to catch more fish. In my coast, because we're in my constituency, we've got the southwest fish market, it's mostly things like seafood, so it's lobster and langoustine, and it's things, 86% goes to Europe. And what I hear from all across is actually a difficulty getting crew. So there's a lot of boats that are tied up. So losing EU nationals who are currently working on boats. In the West Coast, it's almost impossible to get the Home Office to let you bring in Filipino fishermen who have a big tradition of working in Scotland, because on the West Coast, you're talking internal waters, because our islands go way out to the Outer Hebrides, and they won't give them visas. In the Northeast, where there was the very strong leave vote from the big whitefish trawlers, what you're talking about is people get a transit visa. When you come to fish processing, when you come to the people who want to sell the fish to Europe, there isn't the leave support there. So, you're talking sometimes bits of industries, and we're seeing the same in farming. Who's going to pick the strawberries and raspberries? We've seen a lot of crops wasted even in 2017. So, that's often described, for that industry it'll be great. But if you go down into the kind of granular level, what you'll find is that there may be one piece of that industry that think this is going to be nirvana. And in actual fact, the industry will struggle because we won't have a market to sell.
So a question on Northern Ireland then, and changing moods within Northern Ireland, especially if they see attitudes such as that of Daniel Hannan with regard to the Good Friday Agreement. Has this caused any shifting in the ground in terms of loyalties and what people would support, whether it be United Ireland, whether it be the concept of remaining in the single market with the border in the Irish Sea? Is this being openly discussed? Or is it not shifting people from political loyalties and just starting to bubble up in generic irritation?
I'll have to actually try and answer that from a personal perspective, because the BMA is an apolitical organisation, and also then hand over to our colleague who is actually in Westminster. But from a personal perspective, I fear that the Brexit vote was based so heavily on entrenched cultural/tribal differences that rational argument may not change people's minds. And that's, to reiterate, my own personal view.
There is, however, there was some polling done around the, should the border be at the border or in the Irish Sea? And in actual fact, it showed majority support for it being in the Irish Sea. People thought, you're putting something on a ship, you're probably checking it anyway. How big a deal is it? And that support was also carried into the more Protestant Unionist community. So although the DUP are adamant that they won't accept it, in actual fact, if you look at people from both sides of the community in Northern Ireland, they're looking for a practical and pragmatic solution. One of the dramatic things when you're talking about, perhaps a more open-mindedness about a united Ireland is the number of people in the north applying for Irish passports, and that includes people who would describe themselves as Protestant and Unionist. I was on BBC Northern Ireland because I'm their kind of pet Northern Ireland MP who isn't a Northern Ireland. You can hear the accent. I mean, it's just creeping out.
Not too bad.
On the Sunday after the vote, and you're always held chatting to a producer before you're actually on the radio, and she was saying, well, we're staunch Unionists, and that's a very recognisable phrase, staunch, in Northern Ireland, but we're helping our daughter apply for an Irish passport. The idea of staunch Unionists carrying an Irish passport just wouldn't have computed. So in actual fact, you are talking about all the old knowns and, if you like, brick walls. You can't count on any of them. And I think that applies in Scotland, and I think it applies in Northern Ireland. So you might poll people, you might not see big difference because people have no idea what this is all going to mean, and they're going, let's see, maybe common sense will come in. But underneath that, I think the sands are shifting.
And perhaps what we're seeing is, just as Westminster has decided to take back control, when you're 450 miles away from it, it's never looked less competent. And after decades of perhaps divergence in law through the devolved administrations, pulling away at those threads, as we're doing with Brexit, is a reckless thing to do. And to quote Donald Rumsfeld, you've got your known knowns, your known unknowns, and your unknown unknowns. And I think the future of the union is probably at risk in the medium term, more because of Brexit. And it's a matter of great shame to me that the unionists who fought very hard in 2014, I was a no voter then, seem to have given up on that battle. And certainly when you look at the condition of Westminster now, you wouldn't have confidence that the people there have either really the determination or the skills to knit everything back together after Brexit, and that should worry anyone who would.
Or even the interest. I mean, the feeling in Scotland and indeed Northern Ireland, when you have a former Northern Ireland minister like Owen Paterson making comments about the Good Friday Agreement, is it's not just even the ability or the bandwidth, but it's that actually they don't really care. And that's what it feels like.
And this morning, Lord Owen was talking about the Lansley reforms and the marketisation of the NHS and how maybe now we're out of the EU, that may not come to pass over the whole of the NHS. Prior to Brexit, we were all worried in the NHS about TTIP and how the agreement of the EU may bring in a marketisation. So I suppose that now that Brexit isn't going to be reversed, it would be highly unlikely if we had a second referendum. I suppose what I'm asking for is some kind of glimmer of hope that we won't have virgin healthcare throughout England and then therefore spread to the three other nations.
I think it's really something that's down to England, and I think that it's something that people in England need to realise. There's a lot of marginal MPs out there. So, you know, get involved in whatever your local process is, make sure that they know that you've got their number. But at the moment, what you have is you have a gradual drift. So every time there's a tendering, almost half of those contracts will go. So exponentially, it's getting worse. But it's still a reasonably small proportion of NHS England that is actually run by private providers. So to me, you're not in a position of, right, we're beyond the point of no return. And obviously the NHS Re-establishment Bill, and you know, I supported Caroline Lucas in that, and my proposal in that would have been, it's not a matter of cancelling all contracts and getting sucked into litigation, but to have a principle of, as contracts and franchises come up for renewal, you actually have a concept of returning those services to the NHS. Because this is not something, well, you know, we're not in the ECJ, we've not been dragged because we don't allow, you know, private providers to come and bid in NHS Scotland. So to me, what Lord Owen said was complete fallacy. It's being used as an excuse to say, oh great, maybe we can do something. No, if you were doing it, as Joe said, the EU fundamental right to health still always comes into weighing it up. So if the government here was going to the EU and saying, okay, I know about competition law, but we actually, this didn't work. We want to find our way back. Then you can argue the balance of better health, spending the money better, not squandering it on profit, and actually going back to having a kind of cooperative, non-fragmented health service. And I think that is crucial. Brexit is actually an irrelevance to that. And I would say the threat of post-Brexit trade deals with America is the thing that would actually risk increasing it. And the accountable care organisations would say that the group at the top must be put out to tender. So that what you would have instead of our statutory health boards could easily be either a combination or just a private company that can hide behind commercial sensitivity. That is what could really accelerate the quantity of services that are privatized. So I still think it's a relatively small proportion, maybe about 10% or less. So it's, you know, there's still time to actually say, no, we're not having this. We're actually going to fight it. And as I say, Brexit is an irrelevance. You could reverse it as easily as we did and just not put up with this, because otherwise it's going to eat your health service from the inside.
Just to jump onto that, you know, again, what potentially we might lose is we move from a system, EU law governance and the values within that. If we look at something like the competition law regime and certain sort of safe harbours that have come through, so an economic activity that has been, or activity that's been premised on basis of solidarity, that these things have been sort of protected from the scope of competition law principles. Now, if we're no longer part of that competition law regime, then there's sort of all of that's to play for within a UK context. So again, it's decisions to be taken here, political decisions to be taken here.
Well, I mean, it was David Cameron's decision not to put NHS on the front of TTIP. Other countries put down public services, key industries, and he chose not to do that. Theresa May has categorically not excluded the NHS from an American trade deal. And to me, a kind of Tory-Trump trade deal with no backing of EU, no backing of EU populations, who managed to get a lot of things changed around TTIP, managed to get rid of the investor state dispute tribunals. Without that backing, in actual fact, is infinitely worse than TTIP. So the decision not to protect the NHS, these decisions are being made here. They may be being blamed on Europe, but they're actually politicians here.
Okay, we get one last question for him. There's someone up the back who hasn't.
Who's the lady at the back?
Yep.
The very back, who was?
She's still got a hand up.
I think we should come to.
Well, we take two then. We'll take the chap here and then the lady at the back.
Excuse me.
Just a quick one going back to what you mentioned earlier about possibly devolving immigration powers alongside. Just wondering what you thought that might look like in terms of devolved health authorities, devolved immigration policy, and what impact that could potentially have on the freedom of movement within the UK.
Well, you know, in actual fact, we're not planning to ban tourists. So freedom of movement within the UK, I would hope, will not actually be an issue, or your tourist industry is completely kiboshed. It's actually what they're talking about is your freedom to have a job, your freedom to rent a house, etc. So if you're actually in Scotland, where we call you a new Scot and we welcome you and you work in our NHS, why are you going to come down and be an illegal immigrant in England? You know, that just doesn't make sense. There are other examples, Australia and Canada particularly, where provinces have their own immigration powers because they may be more remote, they may have particular industries. But for us in Scotland, you know, with this obsession of Theresa May of getting down to tens of thousands, I mean, this is the woman who in the Home Office had, you know, the kind of, let's make people really unwelcome, let's have vans that say go home, etc. If that is the drive for the whole of the UK, then we are going to struggle, and we're going to struggle with, you know, NHS workforce, universities. You know, the UK, as we heard earlier, punches way above its weight in research, and particularly life science research. So does Scotland. We're 8.3% of the population. We get about 13% of the funding because we've got 5 ancient universities for 5 million people, plus a whole lot of more modern universities. So we're a very academic country. 45% of our young population either have a degree or a higher qualification. So we're a very academic population. So for us, if we can't attract researchers, if we can't be part of these networks, obviously all of that will slide back. So immigration, I would say, across all of our industries is our number one. And the problem for us is that's just been dismissed out of hand. So something, as I say, it's not just about sectors, it's also working age people, people who are paying tax, because our population is older. So if we can't get that, it becomes very difficult for Westminster to say they're listening to our concerns, they're flexible, we're a family of nations. If we're down to tens of thousands, then Scotland's going to be really struggling. We could look like St Kilda.
And perhaps one of the other problems, going back to Joe's point earlier, is that it would be a big shift to have a regional immigration policy. How do we police that? How do we negotiate between the different parts of the UK? So if you've come to Scotland to be a doctor and you want to move to London to be a doctor, but you've only got the licence for Scotland, how is that managed, negotiated?
You'll have to apply.
But it's a maturing of the relationship between the two. So one last question from the lady at the back.
Looking at the next few years, the discussions and then the transition period, what role do you see for NHS organisations and NHS staff to try to protect health in the devolved nation and try to protect some of the innovation and innovative policies that have been put in place in the devolved nations?
I think for me, and you know, this is something that before the referendum, all my little online videos, all my articles were about. The EU is not just about trade. Everything, both before the referendum and since, has obsessed about trade. You know, whether it's the social chapter or workers' rights or sharing in these networked agencies, we've made massive gains from the EU. And I think if you're in health, if you're in the NHS, all of us have a responsibility to make sure that the people around us understand that. Because unless we can get that kind of groundswell to try and put pressure on the politicians, then these things will happen without us interacting with them. As was mentioned this morning, Jeremy Hunt is not part of the Brexit cabinet. He wasn't at Chequers. There hasn't been an impact assessment done on either the NHS or health. It's all industry sectors. And therefore we need to get the public to realise, so that through them we get the politicians to recognise that in actual fact it's this networking and it's this being part of the group that has brought the benefit. So there's no point in us just moaning at the shaving mirror. You need to be talking to colleagues, you need to be coming out, we need to be having the debate now that we should have been having 2 years ago.